Welcome back, everybody. You're listening to Crime Syndicate Stories, the podcast where we map the intersection of crime, power, syndicates, sometimes clandestine operations, and sometimes just other stuff in between. Maybe it was a good book that we read or an article, something that kind of fueled some of the research. But I'm your host, and you can call me Kara. Now, if you're familiar with the podcast, then you know that we've just completed a mini-series about the Russian Mafia in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. We're not totally done with the Russian Mafia yet, because like many other organized crime syndicates, time passes, power shifts, things evolve, new blood comes in. We do have some continued names to discuss, so don't worry, we will get there. These organized crime syndicates tend to intersect quite a bit, so we're going to make our way back to the Russian Mafia. But this podcast overall is about the intersectionality of organized crime. How they intersect, not just with each other, sometimes, other crime syndicates, across the globe, sometimes government officials, intelligence operations, and a lot of other things in between. That in mind, though, I want to touch on the intersection of the Russian Mafia with the Italian Mafia, in New York, specifically in that Brooklyn area, and specifically with the Colombo Crime Family. And it's an easy question. We might ask, why the Colombo Crime Family? And the most obvious answer is because, there's this obvious intersection, which is Brooklyn, New York. So before we leave Brooklyn or Brighton Beach completely behind, again, we'll come back to it. There's another group, though, that we want to discuss, to a certain extent with this intersection. So if you recall our previous episode, then if you haven't listened to it, kind of go back and check that out. We tried to set up this intersection, but we did so in the last episode discussing the rise of Boris Mayfield, more specifically how his rise in leadership didn't necessarily come in a vacuum. He didn't build his empire in a completely empty city. He built it in New York. Obviously, this is a place where maybe every inch of territory is potentially already spoken for. And in South Brooklyn, the men that kind of claimed that territory long before the Russians arrived, it belonged to one family. So you guys remember how in The Golden Girls, Sophia Petrillo used to start her stories with, picture it, Sicily, insert the year, right? Okay, well, picture it, South Brooklyn, a neighborhood that's always been, if we can say this, maybe a neighborhood that's always been a neighborhood of borders. Not necessarily, though, the borders that you might see on a map, but maybe more along the lines of the kind you can feel. Maybe you can see them as you're walking through the neighborhood, but the kind where maybe there's the smell of, it's the Russian bakery. Is it pelmeni? I feel like I'm getting that incorrect, but what's coming out of that just smells amazing out of the Russian bakery storefront. But maybe then a couple of blocks over, there's a Colombo Crime Family social club, and maybe that space hums with the tension, maybe the quiet tension or loud tension, but the tension of men who've been spending their lives maybe policing some of these invisible or not so invisible lines. Can you picture that? And if so, kind of couple that with what we know from our previous episode. So the Russian mob didn't come to South Brooklyn necessarily looking for permission to do anything from anyone. And the Colombo family, at the time that the Russians are coming to town, we can maybe wonder, were they a family that were really in a position to enforce permission, even if anybody had asked for it, obviously, which the Russians didn't. But this is the story of what happens when two criminal cultures kind of collide in the same neighborhood, an old one and a new one, and maybe then how some of their uneasy coexistence set a stage for, the mafia's national governing body, the commission, to step in. So there's likely some foreshadowing for the next intersection jump once we can, kind of complete this Colombo miniseries arc. But now, the Colombos, they weren't the biggest of the five families. They weren't the richest, but they had some hustlers. But they were closest geographically to, and probably economically to, and maybe temperamentally as well, to the world that Mayfield from our previous episode operated in. And that proximity, it meant friction. It meant negotiation and tension, sometimes cooperation, sometimes conflict. If you want to understand the world that the Russians stepped into, that when they came to the United States, if you want to understand the rules that Neufeld needed to learn how to navigate, if you want to understand how power really worked in New York, well, this is kind of where you have to start. You have to, with a family that stood closest to, the Russian organized crime syndicate, and that is the Colombo family. And this is where this new miniseries in our attempts to highlight intersectionality of organized crime continues. So to understand the Colombos, you need to understand or be able to picture the idea of Brooklyn, not necessarily Brooklyn with the coffee shops and condos that we might think of today. I mean the older Brooklyn, the Brooklyn of the 1950s through the 1990s. Brooklyn wasn't just one neighborhood, but it was a cluster of worlds pressed together, this patchwork of neighborhoods, each with its own loyalties, sometimes its own codes, and these kind of quiet borders that each of these neighborhoods needed to learn to navigate. There were other borders throughout the city, obviously, the Italian Mafia, and we're going to get into all of them at some point, but just to highlight them here, because they're not who we're focusing on in terms of the intersectionality. But there were other borders throughout the city, so just so folks recognize, the Genovese ruled Manhattan, the Gambinos kind of ruled the docks and the airports, Lucchese had the garment district, and the Bonanos, they just kind of carved out their own corners kind of all throughout, as I understand it. Now, we'll get into each of the five families, just, again, not in this particular miniseries, because remember, this particular podcast is about intersection of organized crime syndicates, power, and even clandestine intelligence operations, and what all of those intersections look like. So trust me, we're going to get there as we kind of carve our way through this web of organized crime. But for now, though, we're going to focus on what's going on in Brooklyn, New York. And the Colombos, they ruled South Brooklyn. Specifically, this wasn't just about territory. It was identity. It was home turf. It's where money flowed. Their money flowed. And when the Russians arrived in the late 1970s and early 1980s, they arrived at the Colombo's doorstep. We want to set the geographic scene just a little bit further. So think about Brighton Beach, the Russian cafes, the black market money wiring, the jewelry stores kind of doubling as these laundering fronts. Bensonhurst and Gravesend were kind of the Colombo strongholds. They had the social clubs, the card games, the union guys, the bookmaking operations, things like that. Coney Island, as best I can tell from some of the research, it was kind of a dividing line between these two criminal worlds, so maybe just an unofficial border. And when the Russians came into town, recall from the previous mini series about the Russian organized crime, they didn't come quietly. They came with cash, they came with connections, and just this willingness to do business with anyone, or no one sometimes. But to the Italians, and especially the Colombos, this was a problem. Again, just being their very close border neighbors. It wasn't also necessarily because the Russians weren't particularly violent yet, even though in a lot of ways that they were, but they were just more so unpredictable. The Mafia thrived, though, on predictability, whereas the Russians thrived on, chaos. But with the chaos, you can imagine there was this little bit of a cultural clash. The Italians believed in hierarchy. They had the boss, the underboss, the consiglieri, the captains, the soldiers. The Russians believed more so in networks, fluid alliances, shifting loyalties, not as much known for their formal ranks. The Italians taxed everything: gambling, loans, protection. The Russians refused to be taxed, it seems like, only maybe just only paid when they felt like it suited them. To the Colombos, though, the Russians were like a new species. They didn't kiss rings. They didn't ask permission. They didn't care about the rules of the five families, like the five families' rules. They just didn't care about those things. Rules that had kept New York's underworld stable for decades. And stability, is really an important piece to the success of organized crime overall. It's not the only factor, but it's still a really important factor nevertheless. And the Colombos, already the smallest, but we can just say maybe the most unstable of the five families from what we can tell within a lot of the research, just did not seem that they were in any shape to enforce those rules. Additionally, they had this long history of just their own stability issues on their own, making relationships with the other five families even before the Russians came in, but making the relationships with the other five families and the commission strained at times. So, they couldn't. How could they expect to find consistent stability, with the Russian Mafia? What we're describing, and I think it's very safe to say, the Colombo family has been the outlier within the five families within New York. And it feels quite harsh to say this, but because of just the relationship that they had within each other, maybe they were the family that shouldn't have survived. Not with the three wars that just kept consistently tearing the family apart, only for them to have to rebuild again. Seriously, three civil wars, three internal bloodbaths, and these moments where the family just very nearly ripped itself apart from the inside. And if we're being honest, most mafia families fight their enemies. The Colombos were fighting each other. And yet somehow they endured and they rebuilt and they reorganized, and somehow through all of that they managed to keep their grip on South Brooklyn. But maybe we can also say, though, that this instability is partially what made them so dangerous, because they were so unpredictable. I think it certainly helped make things for their family a little bit more interesting. But lack of stability and unpredictability within this world, we know that causes or creates openings, opportunity. And I think that's opportunity that the Russians would eventually step in on. And again, the Russians came to the United States, but long before, Brighton Beach became Little Odessa, the Colombos had already built their criminal enterprise, their criminal infrastructure in South Brooklyn. This included loan sharking. This was really just that lifeblood of street level power. It included gambling, from basement card games to full-scale operations. Labor racketeering was another predominant activity, especially when you think about for the Colombos within construction and the trucking industry. Protection rackets was another endeavor, that quiet tax on businesses for protection. There was also union influence and, this direct line to city contracts, if you will. They weren't very glamorous rackets. They weren't cinematic, but they were practical, they were predictable, and they were profitable. And they created a template, maybe just a blueprint for how, the neighborhood control went. So when the Russians arrived, they didn't just enter into a new country. They entered into a pre-existing ecosystem, one with rules, one with boundaries, and one with consequences for when those rules are broken. So slowly, though, as the Russians entered, and as we discussed in the previous miniseries, Brighton Beach became Little Odessa. That boardwalk was still the boardwalk, old men playing chess, kind of picture that, families strolling along out there. The smell of salt water, if you're really paying attention, probably just with maybe that smell of fried dough from some of the, kind of the storefront shops out there on the boardwalk, But over time, those storefronts, they started changing. And we talked about this in the last episode. This is where the Russian bakeries came in, the pharmacies, the nightclubs and the restaurants. And all of this happened. And you better believe the Italians, and the Colombos specifically, they noticed. How could they not, right? The Colombos had controlled South Brooklyn for decades. They knew every bar owner. They knew every bookmaker, every union rep. Then suddenly there were these new faces, new money, new rules. And the Italians weren't necessarily the only ones watching, because the Russians were watching the Italians too. So all this is happening, and we have these groups kind of watching each other. And then there's this first brush that the Colombos have with the Russians. When the first wave of the Soviet immigrants, arrived in Brighton Beach, the Colombos didn't panic necessarily right away. Not right away did they see them as a threat. I believe they saw them as an opportunity. Did the Colombos notice the Russians early? Yes. Not because the Russians were loud. They weren't. Not because they were violent, because not at first. They weren't. But the Russians, they proved themselves to be independent. So, again, picture this. new businesses coming in, new gamblers, new people who needed loans, new people who needed protection. A Colombo soldier walks into a Brighton Beach nightclub, for, let's say, and sees a man he doesn't recognize kind of running that door. A Colombo loan shark might go or might hear that there's a new crew lending money with lower rates. A Colombo bookmaker learns that maybe Russian gamblers are running their own card games and not paying tribute. These weren't provocations at first, right? They were misunderstandings. We're going to call them cultural collisions. But even in that, the Italians expected deference, and the Russians just didn't give it. Not because they were disrespectful, but because in the Soviet underworld, the Italian mafia, it wasn't a myth. It wasn't a legend. It wasn't even something that was relevant to them, to be honest. You see, the Russians weren't really like any other immigrant group, that the Italians might have absorbed over the decades. The Russians didn't come from this culture of deference. They didn't come from a world where the mafia was a distant rumor. The Russians didn't grow up fearing the five families. They grew up with that concept of fearing that thieves-in-law concept. Men who made the mafia look, in their eyes, like amateurs. They came from the Soviet Union, a place where the black market was a survival mechanism and where this thieves-in-law concept ran a parallel to government. So the Russians didn't bow. They didn't ask permission. They didn't play by the old rules that the Italians were accustomed to having people play by. So when the Colombos approached them with this kind of usual message of, you're in our neighborhood, you pay us, the Russians just didn't react the way the Italians expected them to. They didn't argue, they didn't negotiate, they just didn't pay. And when the Colombos realized this wasn't just another wave of newcomers, this was a different kind of criminal. So they realized that working with the Russians wasn't going to be a simple endeavor. And when these things aren't a simple endeavor, it kind of sets the stage for conflict, right? Let's backtrack a little bit and think about the time. So by the early 1980s, the Russians were growing fast. If you recall from the previous miniseries, they had Agrin, they had Balagula, they had Neifeld. We did a podcast on each of those men, but they were building their own rackets. Some overlapping with the Italians and some not. They were moving money, moving product, and moving influence. And again, Colombos were watching, not with fear, not with respect, but, with calculation as they were trying to figure them out. Because in the underworld, coexistence is, recall, kind of a temporary concept, right? Territory is always contested. Power is always shifting. And the Colombos, despite their internal chaos, they were still one of the five families. They still had a seat at the commission, and they still had this weight of history behind them. So the Russians were rising, but the Italians were still the gatekeepers. But as all of this is occurring, and then they have their first attempts at negotiation. So the Colombos weren't stupid. They didn't want a war, not after their three internal ones, but they wanted clarity. They wanted they wanted to be able to go in, send some emissaries in, not bosses, not capos, but soldiers, men who could read a room. The Russians they sent their own men, not bosses either, but trusted lieutenants, men like Neifeld, and who understood both the street and kind of these very high stakes. The meetings were quiet initially. They were on neutral ground, back rooms, cafes, no guns on the table, but plenty in the room, right? Kind of that vibe is what it kind of felt like. The message from the Italians was simple, though. We run South Brooklyn, you operate here, you kick up. Their responding of, kind of a simple response is, we don't kick up to anyone. But here's the thing. They didn't necessarily say it with arrogance. They just said it with confusion, right? They're still new here. In the Soviet underworld, recall, you didn't pay tribute unless you were a part of the same, the same system. And the Russians didn't see the Italians as part of their world. The Italians didn't see the Russians either necessarily as a part of their world. Two criminal cultures, two sets of rules, one neighborhood, and in that environment, something had to give. But what came, for a time, perhaps some coexistence out of necessity. The Colombos could have escalated. They could have forced the issue. They could have, set and made an example, but initially they didn't. The Russians weren't trying to take over the Italian rackets at the time. They weren't shaking down Colombo businesses. They weren't interfering with the unions, it seemed, or the construction deals that were going on. They were running their own world, parallel at the time, but not perpendicular. And for a while, that seemed like that mattered. And the Colombos were already weakened by their own internal wars, and they were under these growing federal, amounts of federal pressure. They made a calculation that it was just better to coexist than to fight with a new enemy. So there might have been this spoken or unspoken agreement with this new enemy. The Russians stayed out of the Italian rackets. The Italians stayed out of the Russian rackets. Everyone made money, and everyone stayed alive. It wasn't friendship, and it certainly wasn't alliance, it seemed like, but it just seemed like survival for both groups. And in the underworld, survival's perhaps the only rule that truly matters. And it was this coexistence that came out of necessity and out of some of this calm before some additional Colombo family turmoil. There was one racket, though, if we recall, that brought the Russians and the Colombos closest together. And, honestly, it was probably one of the rackets that caused, potentially could have made them, kill each other as well. But it was one that brought them, both syndicates a whole lot of success. And that was the gasoline tax scam. If you're not familiar with it, it's kind of a simple concept, but you create a fake company, you import gasoline, you sell that gasoline, and then you collect the taxes on that gasoline. And then you need to just go disappear before the government comes looking for you. The Russians perfected it. Murat Balagula had turned it into an empire. Tens of millions of dollars flowed through shell companies every single month. And the Colombos wanted a piece, right? At the time, the Russians didn't necessarily want partners, but the scam was too big to hide, probably too profitable for others to ignore. So the two sides did something kind of rare in the underworld. They talked. Not necessarily because they trusted each other, but probably more along the lines of because they needed each other. The Italians had the political connections, and, they had the trucking unions and the distribution networks and the political connections. The Russians, they had the financial brains and these overseas contacts, right? So together they made more money than either could have done alone. But, these types of alliances are often built on greed, and greed can make these alliances incredibly fragile. Like, we recognize that. So this wasn't necessarily just about the gasoline tax scheme, though. There was a rise in some of the nightclub activity and the boardwalk economy, too, as I understand it. Brighton Beach was a whole new world in and of itself, with these neon lights and vodka bottles and, this steady flow of cash that just didn't ever seem like it flowed through a bank. The Russians ran the clubs, and then the Italians ran the streets around them. So what did this mean? This could mean a lot of different things, but I think it probably meant some shared security crews, some shared protection rackets, shared gambling profits, probably some shared headaches as well. A Colombo family soldier, though, might walk into a Russian nightclub to collect a fee, only to find that the Russians already had their own enforcers. The Russian bookmaker might run a card game, only to find out that, the Italians had been running a card game on that block for many years. Now, these weren't necessarily turf wars, though. They were some misunderstandings, and misunderstandings, though, let's be honest, can get people killed. So the two sides created these informal boundaries. The Russians controlled the clubs, the Italians controlled the streets. Everyone controlled the gambling kind of together. It wasn't peace, but there was some sort of balance. And honestly, a balance is kind of a rare thing to exist within the confines of organized crime. There were additional opportunities, though, to coexist. There was construction and the trucking and the union rackets. The gas scam that the Russians, well, it was the Russians' entry point, to be honest, into construction and the trucking that were the Colombo stronghold. The Italians had the union bosses, the shop stewards, the no-show jobs, the contract kickbacks, right? They had a lot of control. The Russians had cash, a whole lot of muscle, and a willingness to bend the rules that Italians wouldn't touch, to be honest with you. But balance has a way of finding its tipping point. So when the Russians started creating businesses, and these businesses started popping up in South Brooklyn, the trucking companies, the warehouses, the construction outfits, the Colombo stepped in. No threats with offers. You want to operate here, use our union guys. You want protection, we'll provide it. You want contracts, we'll make the calls to get those contracts. The Russians didn't love it, but they understood it. And in the Soviet Union, the state controlled everything in Brooklyn. At the time, the Colombos did. And sometimes the Russians even preferred dealing with the Italians because it seems like they found the Italians predictable. And predictability, and having predictability can sometimes be put you in a powerful place if you can find that level of predictability. And the Colombos still had plenty of power. So it was an uneasy alliance, but all alliances don't last forever. And over time, cracks in the relationship just became a lot more noticeable. And some of those things that were noticeable, as the Russians grew richer, the Italians grew more suspicious. The Colombos grew more suspicious. As the Italians grew weaker, the Colombos grew weaker with their own internal kind of chaos. The Russians grew bolder. And as the Colombos descended into their third civil war, the Russians expanded into, into those gaps, filling those gaps. And you could kind of sense through a lot of the reading or even things you kind of hear on the History Channel or within YouTube with some other videos, you felt like there was this sense of balance that was very shifting, quietly at first, but inevitably shifting. And soon, as the Colombos were in their turmoil, the commission would have to step in, not because of the Russians per se, but because the Colombos were tearing themselves apart again. In that moment, while the Russians were stepping in, it wasn't the Russians stepping in that was the threat. It was why they were stepping in and how they were able to step in, because the Colombos were, operating in chaos. Now that we've kind of explored the start of this intersectionality and this uneasy alliance, we're kind of officially shifting from the Russian Mafia to the Colombo Crime Family. And we're going to start that mini arc next. So within the next episode, we're going to explore the Colombo family. We're going to talk a little bit about the Colombo family turmoil. And within this family turmoil, this is where the family was kind of ripe for exploration, not just from the Russians and their shared geographic border, but, in Brooklyn, but with other crime syndicates as well. I hope you enjoyed this podcast and kind of looking into the intersection of the Russian Mafia with the Colombo Crime Family. I hope it's piqued your interest. We're going to make that shift into the Colombo Crime Family and the Italian Mafia as we make our way towards having the commission step in. But then once the commission steps in, like where that can quite literally branch us off in this web of organized crime in a lot of different directions. Please don't forget to subscribe if you kind of like this content. We appreciate you listening. But thank you very much for listening to Crime Syndicate Stories, where we map the intersection of crime, power, and intelligence.